They dragged the horse to the edge of the ranch and left him for the buzzards. Broken leg, sweat-soaked coat, eyes wide with fear. No rancher wasted feed on a cripple. Mercy, if it came, was usually a bullet. But when a drifter named Jonah Hayes stumbled across the dying animal, he didn't turn away. He knelt in the dust, whispered a name, and made a promise that would bind man and beast against every cruel hand the West could deal. What followed became the legend of Timber Mesa. The spring sun over the high desert plains burned with a steady heat, the kind that made the dust shimmer and the sagebrush give off its sharp, dry scent. The air carried the faint rattle of cicadas and the long cry of a hawk that wheeled high above. Out near the broken-down fences of the Rocking Spur Ranch, a horse lay in the dirt, sides heaving, sweat turning its bay coat to a patchwork of dark stains. Its once proud mane was tangled with burrs, and its eyes rolled white with a mixture of pain and fear. Its front leg, swollen and bent at a wrong angle, told the story plain enough. This was a horse no rancher wanted anymore. This was a horse left for the coyotes and the sun. The ranch hands had already turned their backs. They'd spat in the dirt, muttered about wasted feed, and said the boss was right to be rid of it. A horse that couldn't run cattle, couldn't pull, couldn't even stand without trembling. What good was it? No one wasted time on an animal that couldn't earn its keep. In the West of 1881, mercy came in the form of a bullet, quick and clean, if a man was feeling charitable. But the boss hadn't spared one for this animal. He just said, "Drag it to the far edge. Leave it. It'll be buzzard feed soon enough." The horse lay there alone, broken and forgotten, dust settling on its flanks. It should have been the end of the tale. But as the sun dropped toward the western horizon, painting the land in fire and shadow, a lone figure came walking slow along the fence line. His hat was sweat-stained, brim curled from years of use, his boots cracked and carrying the dust of miles. His shirt was threadbare, his jeans patched, and he carried no rifle, no saddle, no bedroll, just a man walking because he had nowhere else to go. Folks in town called him the drifter, sometimes the squatter, other times just the homeless cowboy who haunted the edges of saloons and camps, trading odd jobs for a meal, sleeping under the stars when no barn roof was offered. His name, at least the one he carried now, was Jonah Hayes. Jonah had once been a cowboy proper, with a place at a bunkhouse table and a string of horses to ride. He'd ridden herd across the Llano Estacado, through Montana's cold valleys, and down into New Mexico's barren reaches. But somewhere along the trail, bad luck and worse choices had stripped him of every steady thing a man could hold. A ranch fire had taken his wages one year. A crooked card game had swallowed his horse the next. A fever had carried off the woman he'd thought he might marry. After that, Jonah just kept moving, because stopping meant remembering. As he walked now, head bent against the sun, he caught sight of the bay horse lying half hidden by tall grass near the rotting fence. At first he thought it dead, but then a shudder ran through its body, and a low groan slipped from its throat. Jonah stopped, boots scuffing the dirt. His gray eyes, weathered by years under the sky, softened in a way they hadn't for a long while. "Well now," he muttered under his breath, kneeling slowly so he wouldn't spook the animal, "ain't you a sorry sight?" The horse's ears flicked back, then forward, its eyes fixed on him, wide and wet, carrying that look every creature has when it knows the end's close. Jonah reached out a hand, palm open, fingers steady despite the tremor in his chest. He whispered, low and even, the way men do when breaking colts, "Easy, boy, easy now. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you no more." The horse snorted weakly, breath hot and shallow. Its body trembled under the weight of pain. Jonah eased closer, his knees sinking into the dust. He laid his rough hand against the horse's neck, feeling the fevered pulse. He could see where the leg had gone wrong, likely snapped in a gopher hole during a hard run, left to swell and rot without a poultice or splint. Any rancher would have shot it quick, spared the feed, but no one had bothered, and now the poor beast lingered. Jonah leaned close, lips near the horse's ear. He whispered again, not words so much as a tone, soft as wind through grass. He didn't even know why he did it. Just something in him, something that had lain empty too long, stirred. He whispered until the animal's frantic breathing slowed, until its eyes stopped rolling so wild. Then he spoke words. "You got a name, don't you? Ain't no horse like you come up without one." He studied the scar across its muzzle, the depth of its chest, the stubborn set of its jaw, even in pain. "Reckon you're a fighter. Reckon you're Dusty." The horse let out a long sigh, its body easing, as if it recognized the sound, as if the simple act of being called something other than cripple or waste meant it wasn't finished after all. From that moment, Jonah knew, he couldn't walk on. Not this time. He rose slow, brushing dirt from his knees, scanning the ranch house far off. The Rocking Spur crew wouldn't care. They'd likely laugh if they saw him dragging a half-dead horse back toward town. But Jonah had nothing left to lose, and maybe this horse was the one thing left worth saving. "I ain't rich," Jonah murmured, stroking the animal's mane. "Ain't got no ranch, no bunkhouse, not even a full belly most nights. But I'll see you through, Dusty, you hear me? Long as you keep breathing, I'll keep you standing." And so began the strangest partnership Timber Mesa had ever seen. A broken-down horse left to die, and a homeless cowboy with nothing but his hands and his stubbornness to give. Jonah set to work with what little he had. He found an old fence post and stripped it, shaping a rough splint. With strips torn from his own shirt, he bound Dusty's leg tight. He scavenged water from a nearby trough, carrying it in his hat when he had nothing else. For 3 nights he slept curled against the horse's side, warding off coyotes with nothing but a stick and his voice, low and steady, telling Dusty stories as if the animal understood, and in a way it did. Each morning, when Jonah woke with the frost stiff in his beard, he found Dusty still alive, still breathing. The swelling went down little by little. The horse tried to rise, failed, then tried again. Jonah lifted with all the strength his wiry frame held, grunting, coaxing, whispering that name over and over. "Up now, Dusty. That's it, boy. You're more than they reckoned. You're mine now." The days stretched into weeks. Word spread to town that the drifter had taken up with a useless horse. The saloon crowd laughed, called him Crazy Jonah, said he was nursing a future carcass. But when Dusty finally stood, trembling but proud, and took 3 halting steps under Jonah's steady hand, the laughter grew quieter. By midsummer, Jonah had traded odd jobs for oats, brushed Dusty's coat until it gleamed again, and even coaxed him into carrying light loads. The limp was there, sure enough, but the fire in the horse's eyes burned brighter than any of the Rocking Spur string. Folks began to notice. The widow Carter let Jonah water Dusty at her well. The blacksmith offered spare nails for the horse's shoes. The children of Timber Mesa, who'd once thrown stones at the hobo cowboy, now followed him wide-eyed, asking to touch Dusty's mane. And through it all, Jonah never stopped whispering that name, Dusty, as if saying it often enough would bind horse and man together against every cruel twist of fate the West could throw. But fate wasn't done with Jonah Hayes. Not yet. The spring sun over the high desert plains burned with a steady heat, the kind that made the dust shimmer and the sagebrush give off its sharp, dry scent. The air carried the faint rattle of cicadas and the long cry of a hawk that wheeled high above. Out near the broken-down fences of the Rocking Spur Ranch, a horse lay in the dirt, sides heaving, sweat turning its bay coat to a patchwork of dark stains. Its once proud mane was tangled with burrs, and its eyes rolled white with a mixture of pain and fear. Its front leg, swollen and bent at a wrong angle, told the story plain enough. This was a horse no rancher wanted anymore. This was a horse left for the coyotes and the sun. The ranch hands had already turned their backs. They'd spat in the dirt, muttered about wasted feed, and said the boss was right to be rid of it. A horse that couldn't run cattle, couldn't pull, couldn't even stand without trembling. What good was it? No one wasted time on an animal that couldn't earn its keep. In the West of 1881, mercy came in the form of a bullet, quick and clean, if a man was feeling charitable. But the boss hadn't spared one for this animal. He just said, "Drag it to the far edge, leave it, it'll be buzzard feed soon enough." The horse lay there alone, broken and forgotten, dust settling on its flanks. It should have been the end of the tale. But as the sun dropped toward the western horizon, painting the land in fire and shadow, a lone figure came walking slow along the fence line. His hat was sweat-stained, brim curled from years of use, his boots cracked and carrying the dust of miles. His shirt was threadbare, his jeans patched, and he carried no rifle, no saddle, no bedroll. Just a man walking because he had nowhere else to go. Folks in town called him the drifter, sometimes the squatter, other times just the homeless cowboy who haunted the edges of saloons and camps, trading odd jobs for a meal, sleeping under the stars when no barn roof was offered. His name, at least the one he carried now, was Jonah Hayes. Jonah had once been a cowboy proper, with a place at a bunkhouse table and a string of horses to ride. He'd ridden herd across the Llano Estacado, through Montana's cold valleys, and down into New Mexico's barren reaches. But somewhere along the trail, bad luck and worse choices had stripped him of every steady thing a man could hold. A ranch fire had taken his wages one year. A crooked card game had swallowed his horse the next. A fever had carried off the woman he'd thought he might marry. After that, Jonah just kept moving, because stopping meant remembering. As he walked now, head bent against the sun, he caught sight of the bay horse lying half-hidden by tall grass near the rotting fence. At first he thought it dead, but then a shudder ran through its body, and a low groan slipped from its throat. Jonah stopped, boots scuffing the dirt. His gray eyes, weathered by years under the sky, softened in a way they hadn't for a long while. "Well now," he muttered under his breath, kneeling slowly so he wouldn't spook the animal. "Ain't you a sorry sight?" The horse's ears flicked back, then forward, its eyes fixed on him, wide and wet, carrying that look every creature has when it knows the end's close. Jonah reached out a hand, palm open, fingers steady despite the tremor in his chest. He whispered, low and even, the way men do when breaking colts, "Easy, boy, easy now. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you no more." The horse snorted weakly, breath hot and shallow. Its body trembled under the weight of pain. Jonah eased closer, his knees sinking into the dust. He laid his rough hand against the horse's neck, feeling the fevered pulse. He could see where the leg had gone wrong, likely snapped in a gopher hole during a hard run, left to swell and rot without a poultice or splint. Any rancher would have shot it quick, spared the feed, but no one had bothered, and now the poor beast lingered. Jonah leaned close, lips near the horse's ear. He whispered again, not words so much as a tone, soft as wind through grass. He didn't even know why he did it. Just something in him, something that had lain empty too long, stirred. He whispered until the animal's frantic breathing slowed, until its eyes stopped rolling so wild. Then he spoke words. "You got a name, don't you? Ain't no horse like you come up without one." He studied the scar across its muzzle, the depth of its chest, the stubborn set of its jaw, even in pain. "Reckon you're a fighter. Reckon you're Dusty." The horse let out a long sigh, its body easing as if it recognized the sound, as if the simple act of being called something other than cripple or waste meant it wasn't finished after all. From that moment, Jonah knew he couldn't walk on. Not this time. He rose slow, brushing dirt from his knees, scanning the ranch house far off. The Rocking Spur crew wouldn't care. They'd likely laugh if they saw him dragging a half-dead horse back toward town. But Jonah had nothing left to lose, and maybe this horse was the one thing left worth saving. "I ain't rich," Jonah murmured, stroking the animal's mane. "Ain't got no ranch, no bunkhouse, not even a full belly most nights. But I'll see you through, Dusty, you hear me? Long as you keep breathing, I'll keep you standing." And so began the strangest partnership Timber Mesa had ever seen. A broken-down horse left to die, and a homeless cowboy with nothing but his hands and his stubbornness to give. Jonah set to work with what little he had. He found an old fence post and stripped it, shaping a rough splint. With strips torn from his own shirt, he bound Dusty's leg tight. He scavenged water from a nearby trough, carrying it in his hat when he had nothing else. For 3 nights he slept curled against the horse's side, warding off coyotes with nothing but a stick and his voice, low and steady, telling Dusty stories as if the animal understood, and in a way it did. Each morning, when Jonah woke with the frost stiff in his beard, he found Dusty still alive, still breathing. The swelling went down little by little. The horse tried to rise, failed, then tried again. Jonah lifted with all the strength his wiry frame held, grunting, coaxing, whispering that name over and over. "Up now, Dusty, that's it, boy. You're more than they reckoned. You're mine now." The days stretched into weeks. Word spread to town that the drifter had taken up with a useless horse. The saloon crowd laughed, called him Crazy Jonah, said he was nursing a future carcass. But when Dusty finally stood, trembling but proud, and took 3 halting steps under Jonah's steady hand, the laughter grew quieter. By midsummer, Jonah had traded odd jobs for oats, brushed Dusty's coat until it gleamed again, and even coaxed him into carrying light loads. The limp was there, sure enough, but the fire in the horse's eyes burned brighter than any of the Rocking Spur string. Folks began to notice. The widow Carter let Jonah water Dusty at her well. The blacksmith offered spare nails for the horse's shoes. The children of Timber Mesa, who'd once thrown stones at the hobo cowboy, now followed him wide-eyed, asking to touch Dusty's mane. And through it all, Jonah never stopped whispering that name, Dusty, as if saying it often enough would bind horse and man together against every cruel twist of fate the West could throw. But fate wasn't done with Jonah Hayes. Not yet. The days grew hotter as July settled over Timber Mesa. Dust storms rolled across the flats, painting the horizon brown, and water grew scarce in the troughs that hadn't been filled since spring rains. Jonah walked Dusty slowly down to the creek each morning, leading him by a length of hemp rope tied gentle around his halter. The limp was still there, but the horse moved steady now, one careful step after another, ears flicking at the buzzing flies, nostrils flaring at the smell of cottonwood bark and wet sand. Each time Dusty lowered his head to drink, Jonah felt a strange tightening in his chest, a mixture of pride and something like fear. Pride that the horse had lived, fear that at any moment it could all be taken away. Another hole, another stumble, another cruel man with a rifle deciding a cripple wasn't worth the grass he ate. But Jonah kept that fear buried deep. He never let Dusty feel it. Around the horse he was steady as stone, his voice always calm, his hand always firm. One morning as they reached the creek, Jonah noticed a figure on horseback watching from the rise across the water. The man wore a white hat, brim straight, and his shirt bore the Rocking Spur brand stitched bold on the chest. His horse was a big chestnut gelding, sleek and muscled, the kind only a ranch with money could keep. The rider just sat there, arms crossed, looking down at Jonah and Dusty with a curl of contempt tugging his mouth. Jonah knew him. Clyde Barrow, foreman of the Spur, a man mean as a rattler and twice as quick to strike. "You still dragging that carcass around?" Clyde called across the water. His voice carried sharp. "Boss said leave it for the buzzards. Can't you follow simple orders, Hayes?" Jonah stroked Dusty's neck, saying nothing at first. He let the horse finish drinking, waited until the gelding on the rise stamped impatiently. Then he looked up. Eyes narrowed against the sun. "Don't reckon your boss's orders run my life, Clyde," Jonah said evenly. "This horse ain't dead yet. Long as he's breathing, he's mine." Clyde spat tobacco juice into the dust. "You got no right claiming Spur property. That horse was ours. We cast him off. but that don't make him yours. Makes him nothing." Jonah's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "A man's worth is how he treats what's weaker than him. Seems to me leaving a horse to rot says plenty about the spur." The foreman's eyes flashed. He started to speak, then just tugged his reins and wheeled his gelding around. The chestnut thundered off in a spray of grit, leaving Jonah standing quiet by the creek. He knew trouble was coming. The spur men wouldn't let him forget he'd taken what they considered theirs. But he also knew he couldn't give Dusty up. Not now. Not after all the nights whispering his name, all the hours binding his leg, all the miles walked beside him. That night Jonah slept light. His Winchester, borrowed long ago and never returned, across his knees. Coyotes yipped far off. Dusty cropped grass slow, hobbled near the fire. Jonah's dreams were thin and restless, full of hoofbeats and angry voices. Days turned into weeks. Jonah worked odd jobs in town, mending fences for the widow Carter, hauling barrels for the barkeep, mucking stables for the livery. Every coin went first to Dusty's feed. Jonah ate what scraps he could, beans cold from a tin, biscuits gone hard, jerky chewed slow. He grew leaner, but Dusty grew stronger. By August the horse carried Jonah for the first time, only a mile, slow and careful, but when Jonah slid from the saddle afterwards, he leaned his forehead against Dusty's and whispered, "You done it, boy. They said you'd die, but you're walking tall again." The horse nickered low, warm breath washing Jonah's cheek. It was the first time in years Jonah felt like he belonged anywhere at all. But belonging draws eyes, and eyes bring danger. One evening, as the sun bled red across the mesa, Jonah rode Dusty into town for supplies. Folks paused to stare. The children whooped, running alongside, shouting, "Dusty! Dusty!" The name had stuck. Everyone knew it now. Even the saloon girls leaned from their balcony, smiling at the sight of the drifter on the horse that refused to die. Inside the general store, Jonah set a small pouch of coins on the counter. "Need oats, sack of flour, and coffee if it stretches." The storekeep, Mr. Dobson, weighed the pouch, lips pursing. "Tight, Hayes. Real tight." "It'll stretch," Jonah said. Dobson shrugged and started filling the order. Jonah leaned against the counter, Dusty tied outside, when the door slammed open and 3 spur men strode in. Clyde Barrow led them, swagger in every step. "Well, look here," Clyde drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it ain't crazy Jonah and his lame nag." The other 2 laughed. One mimicked a limp, dragging his foot across the planks. The other neighed mockingly. Jonah's hand twitched toward his belt, but he forced it still. "Ain't looking for trouble," he said. "Trouble's found you," Clyde sneered. He leaned close, breath stinking of whiskey. "Boss don't take kindly to you making a fool of him. Folks talking about that horse like it's some miracle. That reflects on us, see? Makes the spur look cruel." Jonah's gray eyes met his steady. "Maybe 'cause you are." The room went still. Dobson froze with a scoop of flour in his hand. Clyde's men shifted, hands near their guns. But Clyde only smiled, thin and cold. "You'll regret that, Hayes." He slapped Jonah's hat off his head and walked out, his men close behind. Jonah bent slow, picked up the hat, dusted it off. He said nothing. But inside him, something old and dangerous stirred. He'd been a fighter once, a man who'd drawn quick and ridden hard. He'd buried that self under miles of road and years of silence. But now the spur was digging it back up. That night Jonah sat by the fire outside town, Dusty beside him, and stared long into the flames. "They'll come for us, boy," he murmured. "Question is, do we run or do we stand?" Dusty lifted his head, ears pricked, as if answering. Jonah laid a hand on his mane. "Stand it is, then." The showdown came sooner than expected. 3 nights later, cattle rustlers hit the Rocking Spur herd. They came at midnight, masked, rifles cracking, driving off 100 head into the canyons. By dawn, the spur hands were riled, shouting, saddling up for pursuit. Jonah heard it in town. The boss was furious, the foreman ready for blood. But when the posse rode out, it wasn't Clyde leading. It was Jonah. Because in the saloon, as men argued who should track, a voice spoke up from the back. "That drifter knows the canyons better than any of you. He's lived out there. If you want them cattle back, you let him guide." It was the blacksmith who said it, a man respected for his iron fairness. The room quieted. Eyes turned to Jonah, sitting alone at a corner table. He rose slow, tugged his hat brim low. "I'll track 'em, but not for the spur, for the town. Rustlers take one herd today, they'll take another tomorrow." The boss scowled, but could not deny the sense. And so Jonah rode out front, Dusty beneath him, still limping but strong enough, ears sharp, nostrils flaring as they followed the scent of dust and hoof. Through gullies and over ridges they rode, Jonah reading sign the way some men read books, a bent blade of grass, a rock scuffed, dung still warm. He led them into the maze of canyons where the sun barely reached and shadows stretched like claws. By nightfall they found the herd, penned crude in a box canyon, rustlers camped with rifles stacked. Jonah raised a hand, signaling the posse to halt. He studied the ground, the wind, the lay of the land. Then he dismounted, whispering to Dusty, "Stay quiet, boy." He crept forward, belly to the sand, counting men, 6 rustlers, too many for a frontal charge. He slipped back to the posse. "Circle wide," he murmured. "Cut their horses loose. When they scatter, we ride 'em down." The plan worked. In a rush of shouts and gunfire, the rustlers broke, scrambling for mounts that weren't there. The herd bellowed, stampeding free. Dusty surged beneath Jonah, keeping pace despite his limp, teeth bared like he knew the fight was his. Jonah cornered one rustler against the rocks, Winchester steady. "Drop it, Unyite," he growled. The man obeyed, hands high. All around the spur hands whooped as they recaptured cattle and tied rustlers. By dawn the herd was safe. And Jonah Hayes, the homeless cowboy with the broken horse, was a hero. But heroes draw enemies as quick as friends. Clyde Barrow's glare burned hotter than the rising sun. The sun baked the mesa as the posse drove the herd back toward the spur. Dust rose in choking clouds, and men's tempers flared short. But in every glance Jonah caught from the townsfolk who'd ridden along, there was a new measure of respect. No one called him crazy now. They called him tracker, savior, even cowboy again. Dusty limped but held steady at the front, ears sharp, stride proud. Jonah rode him easy, careful not to strain the mended leg. But Dusty seemed to crave the fight, head tossing, eyes alive. When they passed through Timber Mesa's main street, folks gathered to cheer. The children whooped, running alongside once more, shouting, "Dusty! Dusty!" The blacksmith raised a hammer in salute. Widow Carter wept openly, muttering thanks under her breath. Jonah tipped his hat, but inside he felt a weight heavier than pride, because as he glanced back, he saw Clyde Barrow's face. The foreman rode stiff in the saddle, jaw clenched, eyes dark. A man like Clyde didn't forgive. That evening, Jonah unsaddled Dusty behind the livery and brushed him down, long strokes steady against the horse's flank. Dusty leaned into him, nickering soft. Jonah pressed his forehead against the bay's neck. "We made it through, boy, but storm's brewin'. You feel it too, don't you?" Dusty snorted as if answering. Jonah bedded down in the hayloft that night, rifle close. He dreamed restless of hoofbeats pounding, of guns firing, of Clyde's sneer curling in the firelight. The storm broke 2 nights later. Jonah was crossing the alley behind the saloon, a sack of beans slung over his shoulder, when shadows lunged from the dark. A fist slammed his jaw, spinning him. He staggered, dropping the sack. Before he could draw steel, another blow caught his ribs. He crashed to the ground, gasping. Boots thudded around him. "Well now," Clyde's voice sneered above, "look at the hero of Timber Mesa. Man thinks saving cows makes him somebody." Jonah spat blood, forcing himself to his knees. "You'll never be more'n a coward, Clyde." "Yeah." The foreman's boot caught him in the gut, dropping him again. Laughter echoed in the alley. "You don't belong here, Hayes, you and that nag. I'll see you both gone." Jonah curled around the pane, tasting iron. The boots rained down, thudding ribs, shoulders, back. But through the haze of agony, he clung to one thought. Dusty. He couldn't let them touch Dusty. As suddenly as it began, the beating stopped. Clyde crouched, grabbed Jonah's hair, yanked his head up so their eyes met. "Leave town," Clyde hissed. "Take your cripple horse and vanish. Next time, I don't stop at fists." He shoved Jonah face first into the dirt and stalked off, his men trailing like wolves. Jonah lay there long minutes, groaning, then dragged himself upright. His body screamed with bruises, but his spirit burned hotter. He wiped blood from his lip, muttering through clenched teeth, "I ain't running, not this time." The next morning he saddled Dusty slow, ribs aching with every breath. Townsfolk noticed the bruises, the limp, but Jonah said nothing. He rode out into the hills, needing space, needing to think. He and Dusty climbed high ridges looking down on the wide sweep of the valley. Herds dotted the plains, smoke curled from ranch chimneys, and the sun lit the land gold. Jonah breathed deep, letting the wind scour his anger. "You saved me once, boy," he whispered to Dusty, stroking his mane. "When I was nothing, you gave me something to fight for. I reckon I owe it to you not to back down now." That night he returned to town, limped into the saloon, and dropped into a chair. The piano stuttered into silence. Every eye turned. Jonah ignored them, ordered whiskey, drank it slow. He wanted Clyde to see he hadn't been broken. Sure enough, before long, Clyde barged through the doors, spurs jingling, pistol heavy on his hip. His eyes locked on Jonah. "Well, if it ain't the drifter who don't know when he's licked." Jonah met his gaze, voice calm. "I ain't licked yet." Tension coiled like a rattlesnake. Hands drifted toward holsters, breath held. But the sheriff, old Frank Mallory, shoved between them. "Enough! I'll not have blood in my saloon. Clyde, Jonah, you want to settle something? You do it clean. Sunrise out back of the livery. Pistols fair. Winner takes his piece." The room exhaled as one. Clyde sneered, eyes never leaving Jonah. "Done." Jonah tipped his hat once, then rose and walked out. Dusty nickered from where he was tied. Jonah stroked his muzzle. "Looks like we got ourselves a reckoning, boy." The night dragged long. Jonah sat by Dusty's side, oiling his revolver, whispering low. "If I don't walk away tomorrow, you keep fighting. Find someone else to carry you on. Don't give up, you hear?" Dusty's dark eyes held his steady, unblinking. Jonah felt strength flow back into him. He'd been alone for years, but not now. Not anymore. Dawn broke cold and pale. The town gathered behind the livery, boots crunching frost. Jonah stood straight despite his bruises, revolver loose at his side. Dusty waited tethered nearby, ears pricked, as if knowing. Clyde swaggered into place, grin sharp. "This ends now." The sheriff raised a hand. "On my mark, 3, 2, 1. The pistols flashed. Gunfire split the morning. Birds exploded from the rafters. Jonah staggered, a line of fire grazing his arm, but his own shot struck true, punching Clyde's shoulder, spinning him. The foreman screamed, dropping his pistol. Gasps rippled the crowd. Jonah lowered his gun, chest heaving. He could have finished it, could have ended Clyde for good, but he holstered slow instead. "I ain't a killer no more," he said loud enough for all to hear. "But I won't be driven off. Me and Dusty, we're staying." The sheriff nodded, eyes hard on Clyde writhing in the dirt. Then it settled. From that day, no man openly challenged Jonah again. Respect grew like weeds after rain. He found steady work at the livery, tending horses, earning honest coin. Dusty grew strong, his limp less pronounced, his coat shining with health. But peace never lasts long in the West. Autumn brought raiders down from the hills, desperate men with nothing to lose. They struck ranches, burned barns, stole stock. Fear gripped Timber Mesa. And when the raiders hit the spur one night, it was Jonah and Dusty who answered first. Jonah woke to gunfire and smoke. Dusty whinnied loud, pawing the ground. Jonah leapt from his cot, rifle in hand, and vaulted into the saddle. Together they charged through town toward the glow on the horizon. At the spur, Chaos reigned. Raiders galloped wild, torches in hand. Cattle bawled, men shouted, flames leapt high. Jonah rode straight in, Dusty sure to spite the smoke, weaving through stampeding cows. Jonah's rifle cracked, dropping a raider from his saddle. Dusty lashed out with hooves, sending another sprawling. Jonah shouted above the din, "Drive 'em off! Hold the line!" The townsfolk rallied behind him, spurred by his courage. Guns roared, fists swung, torches fell. Slowly the raiders broke, fleeing into the night. When dawn came, the spur smoldered but still stood. Cattle grazed nervous but safe. And in the yard, Jonah sat Dusty, smoke curling around them, eyes steady as stone. The boss of the spur, a man who'd once spat at Jonah's name, limped forward. His voice cracked with grudging respect. "You saved us, Hayes, you and that horse. Whatever claim you got here, it's yours." Jonah only stroked Dusty's mane, whispering soft, "Ain't mine, it's his. He saved us all." From that day on, no one called Dusty useless again. Winter crept down from the mountains early that year, laying a white blanket across Timber Mesa before November had properly settled. The cottonwoods shed their last leaves, and the creek froze thin along its edges. Ranchers muttered about lean grazing, about wolves bold enough to circle the herds in daylight. Jonah pulled his coat tighter as he forked hay into the livery stalls. His ribs still ached when the cold cut sharp, a reminder of Clyde's boots. But his spirit felt steadier than it had in years. He had work now, a roof when he needed it, coin in his pocket, and Dusty at his side. Dusty had filled out, his coat gleaming rich bay, muscles rebuilt under Jonah's patient care. The limp lingered, but it no longer slowed him much. When children passed the livery, they begged Jonah to let them feed Dusty apples. The horse lowered his great head gently for their small hands. "Gentlest soul I ever seen," the widow Carter said one frosty morning, watching her grandson laugh as Dusty's soft lips plucked a treat from his palm. She turned to Jonah, eyes warm. "That horse is your redemption, Mr. Hayes. Mark my words." Jonah just smiled faint, stroking Dusty's mane. "Maybe he's his own redemption. I just helped him find it." Life might have settled then, might have smoothed into quiet days and warmer nights. But the West seldom allows such peace. One bitter evening, as snow sifted from a steel-gray sky, the sheriff came to Jonah at the livery. His face was grave. "Raiders hit again," he said low, "but not stock this time. They took people. Widow Jenkins and her boy, out at their cabin. Men say the tracks run north into the Badlands." Jonah's gut twisted. The raiders had grown bolder. To steal cattle was one thing. To steal lives, that was war. The sheriff sighed, shoulders sagging under the weight of years. "I ain't got near enough deputies. Town's spooked. But you fought 'em before, Hayes. Will you ride?" Jonah looked at Dusty, who stamped his hoof, breath steaming. "We'll ride," Jonah said. By dawn a small party had gathered. Jonah, the sheriff, 2 ranch hands, and the blacksmith with his long rifle. They followed tracks through snow and brush, every step harder as the land grew wilder. Dusty's ears flicked, nostrils flaring, as if he sensed the trail more than saw it. 2 days they rode. Nights were spent huddled by meager fires, the cold gnawing their bones. On the 3rd morning they found the raiders' camp, a ring of tents by a frozen creek, smoke curling from fires, stolen cattle penned near. And bound to a wagon tongue, shivering but alive, were Widow Jenkins and her boy. Jonah's jaw hardened. He raised a hand, signaling silence. The men crouched low behind rocks. "Too many to fight head-on," the sheriff whispered. "A dozen at least." Jonah studied the camp, his eyes lit on Dusty, standing calm, ears forward. An idea came, wild but clear. "They don't know Dusty," Jonah murmured. "We ride in slow, looking like strays. I'll cut the captives loose while you cover with rifles." The sheriff frowned. "That horse can't outrun—" "He can," Jonah said, voice firm. "He'll run for me." So they did. Jonah swung into the saddle, heart pounding. He urged Dusty forward, loose reins, as if they were just another horse and rider drifting the plains. Snow crunched under hooves. Raiders glanced up, squinting through smoke and frost. Jonah raised a hand, feigning casual. "Howdy, boys," he drawled. "Heard there was shelter here." The raiders eyed him warily. One stepped forward, sneering. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a drifter," Jonah said, sliding his hand down Dusty's neck, closer to his rifle, "looking to warm by the fire." They laughed, but suspicion sharpened their eyes. Jonah eased Dusty closer to the wagon. Widow Jenkins met his gaze, hope flaring. In a blur, Jonah yanked his knife, slashed the ropes, and hauled the boy into the saddle before him. Widow Jenkins scrambled up behind, clinging tight. "Now, Dusty!" Jonah roared. The horse surged, muscles coiling, hooves churning snow. Bullets cracked. Raiders shouted. Dusty leapt the fire pit, smoke swirling his legs, and thundered toward the ridge. Rifles boomed from the rocks, the sheriff and blacksmith laying cover. Raiders toppled, shouting curses. Dusty ran, wind screaming past, his limp forgotten, each stride pure fire. Widow Jenkins sobbed into Jonah's back, her boy clutching his coat. They crested the ridge as bullets sang past, then plunged down the far side into cover. Jonah urged Dusty on until the gunfire faded, until the world was only snow and silence again. At last he slowed, chest heaving, eyes stinging with cold and tears. Widow Jenkins whispered broken thanks. The boy pressed his face into Dusty's mane. Jonah stroked the horse's neck, voice thick. "Knew you had it in you, boy. Knew it all along." By nightfall they were back in Timber Mesa. The town poured into the street, cheering, weeping, praising Jonah and Dusty. The sheriff clasped Jonah's shoulder. "You saved lives, Hayes. Can't nobody call you drifter no more. You're one of us." Jonah looked down at Dusty, who stood proud, breath steaming in the cold. "Reckon I was never alone to start with," he said softly. Word spread quick across the territory. The tale of the broken horse and the homeless cowboy who saved captives rode ahead on every wind. By spring, Jonah Hayes was no longer just a name muttered in saloons. He was legend. But legends attract more than admiration. They attract enemies. The surviving raiders swore vengeance. And Clyde Barrow, nursing his wounded pride, whispered with them in shadow. A plot stirred, darker than before, one that would test Jonah and Dusty like never yet. Spring thaw came slow, dripping icicles from the barn eaves and sending rivulets down the frozen creek beds. Calves bawled in the pastures, and grass pushed green through the melt. Timber Mesa shook off the frost with cautious hope. But beneath the surface, trouble coiled tight. Jonah felt it in the air, the way Dusty lifted his head at night, ears twitching toward the hills. Raiders hadn't forgotten, and Clyde Barrow hadn't forgiven. One evening, Jonah sat on the livery step, rolling a smoke, watching the sun bleed red across the range. Dusty grazed nearby, tail swishing. The blacksmith ambled over, wiping soot from his hands. "You ever think about settling, Hayes?" he asked. "Buying land, building something of your own?" Jonah gave a wry smile. "A man needs coin for that. All I got's a horse with more heart than sense." The smith's eyes softened. "That horse is worth more'n land," he gave this town hope. Jonah looked at Dusty, at the way his coat glowed in the sunset, and his throat tightened. "Maybe one day. For now, reckon we just keep standing." That night, shadows moved at the edge of town. Raiders, lean and hungry, slipped among the cottonwoods. Clyde rode with them, arms still stiff from Jonah's bullet, face twisted with hate. "This time," he whispered, "we don't just take stock. We take the town, and we start by taking that horse." At dawn, gunfire shattered the quiet. Raiders swept into Timber Mesa like a flood, torches high, rifles cracking. Women screamed, children scattered. Jonah jolted awake in the hayloft. Dusty shrieked below, hooves pounding. Jonah grabbed his rifle, slid down the ladder, and burst into chaos. Smoke rolled thick. Raiders whooped, setting fire to the mercantile. Jonah vaulted into Dusty's saddle, shouting, "To arms! Defend your homes!" The sheriff stumbled into the street, shotgun blasting. Ranch hands poured from alleys, rifles ready. But the raiders were many, more than before. Jonah rode hard, Dusty weaving through smoke, rifle barking. A raider lunged with a torch. Dusty lashed out, hooves smashing him down. Jonah's bullet dropped another, who leveled a pistol at the widow Carter's porch. Through the din, Jonah spotted Clyde astride his chestnut gelding, leading the charge, eyes locked on Dusty. He spurred straight for them, pistol blazing. Dusty dodged, Jonah firing back, but Clyde veered away, grinning cruel. "He's mine, Hayes," he roared. The fight raged hours. At last the townsfolk rallied, pushing the raiders back toward the hills. Bodies littered the street, smoke stung the sky. But as Jonah reined Dusty near the well, he realized Clyde was gone, and Dusty was bleeding. A gash scored his flank, crimson staining his bay coat. Jonah leapt down, heart slamming. "Easy, boy, easy." He pressed his bandana to the wound, whispering steady. Ain't bad. You're stronger than this." Dusty trembled, but his eyes stayed clear. Jonah bound the cut tight, tears burning his own eyes. "Don't you quit on me now." The town gathered, battered but alive. The sheriff clasped Jonah's shoulder. "We'd be dead without you and Dusty, but Clyde, he'll come again." Jonah nodded grim, stroking Dusty's mane. "Then we'll be ready." For weeks Timber Mesa rebuilt. Men hammered new boards over blackened beams. Women stitched bandages. Children carried water. And always Dusty was there, his presence a balm, his courage a story whispered over every supper fire. But Jonah knew it was only a matter of time before Clyde struck harder. So he prepared. He drilled the townsfolk in the square, teaching them to fire straight, to stand firm. He scouted the hills with Dusty, mapping every trail, every hollow. One evening, as stars pricked the velvet sky, Jonah sat by the creek, Dusty cropping grass nearby. He spoke low, voice rough. "I lost near everything once, boy. Thought I was done. But you gave me a reason to keep breathing. I ain't letting Clyde take that from me." Dusty lifted his head, ears flicking, as if he understood. Jonah felt a shiver run through him. The bond between them was deeper than rider and horse. It was life binding life. Summer blazed. The land baked hard, creeks shrank, tempers frayed, and then, as sure as thunder follows lightning, Clyde returned. This time he brought near 30 men, outlaws from every corner, promise of plunder drawing them like flies. They came at dusk, a black line across the ridge, rifles glinting. The bell clanged in Timber Mesa. Men grabbed guns. Women herded children into cellars. Jonah swung into Dusty's saddle, rifle slung, pistol at his hip. He rode to the front, eyes scanning the oncoming horde. "Hold steady," he shouted. "Fight for your town, for your families." The raiders poured down like wolves. Gunfire cracked. Smoke choked the streets. Jonah and Dusty charged, a whirlwind of courage. Bullets whipped past. Jonah fired steady, dropping riders. Dusty reared, hooves flashing, scattering men. Through the chaos, Jonah saw Clyde, face twisted with hate, charging straight for them. Their guns roared together. Jonah felt fire graze his side, but his bullet smashed Clyde's gelding in the chest. The horse collapsed, throwing Clyde hard. Dusty lunged, closing the distance. Jonah leapt from the saddle, pistol leveled. Clyde scrabbled in the dust, eyes wild. "Do it," Clyde spat. "Finish me." The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Jonah's hand trembled. Every scar, every bruise, every sneer burned in his mind. He could end it. But then he felt Dusty's breath on his neck, steady, grounding. Slowly, Jonah lowered the pistol. "No," he said, voice steel. "Killing you makes me like you. I'll not carry that weight." The sheriff stepped forward, iron in his eyes. "Then I will." He cuffed Clyde hard, hauling him up. "Prison'll break you worse than any bullet." The raiders broke, scattering into the hills. Timber Mesa stood bloodied but unbowed. Jonah leaned against Dusty, exhausted, tears streaking his dust-caked face. "We done it, boy. We stood." The town cheered, voices rising like thunder, calling his name, calling Dusty's. In that moment, Jonah Hayes was no longer drifter, no longer homeless. He was the man who saved Timber Mesa, and Dusty, the horse left to die, was its beating heart. The days after the raid passed in a blur of smoke and hammering. Timber Mesa bore its scars openly, yet in every nailed board and fresh-cut beam there was pride. Children played once more in the street, chasing each other with wooden sticks, their laughter echoing where screams had rung days before. The people had stood, and they had not fallen. Jonah and Dusty walked the streets side by side. Everywhere they went, heads turned, voices hushed, then rose in thanks. Men clapped to Jonah's shoulder. Women pressed baskets of bread or jars of preserves into his hands. The children followed Dusty like he was a guardian angel, braiding ribbons into his mane, stroking his nose with awe. Yet Jonah never let the praise weigh too heavy. He rose before dawn, worked with the livery hands, checked on the widows who'd lost their men in the fight. At night, he sat beside Dusty in the quiet of the barn, whispering low as always. The horse would lower his head listening, eyes dark and deep with trust. One evening, as a cool breeze swept down from the mountains, Jonah sat outside the barn with his rifle across his knees. Sheriff Mallory joined him, lowering his weary frame onto a stool. They sat in silence a long while before the sheriff spoke. "You ever think on leaving, Hayes? Now that you've proved yourself, some men'd take their name and ride on, let the legend grow." Jonah shook his head slow. "I done enough running in my life. This horse kept me standing. This town gave me a place again. I reckon I'll stay." The sheriff smiled faint. "Glad to hear it. Timber Mesa's stronger with you here." That night Jonah dreamed not of running or fighting, but of building. Fences stretching straight across the plains. A small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. And all was Dusty grazing near, head lifting when Jonah stepped from the door. Weeks turned to months. Spring melted into the blaze of summer. Grass grew tall, herds fattened, and Timber Mesa breathed easier. Clyde Barrow sat in irons down in the county jail, his curses nothing but echoes in stone. The raiders scattered, their power broken. But peace in the West is fragile, always one shadow away from shattering. A band of rustlers moved in from the south come midsummer, hard men with harder eyes, driven not by vengeance, but hunger. They struck a ranch 30 miles from Timber Mesa, leaving bodies and empty corrals. The news reached town on a hot wind. Jonah stood in the street as the rider gasped his tale. He felt Dusty's flank press against his side, steadying him. He knew what must be done. That night, a meeting filled the church hall. Ranchers, merchants, even the saloon girls crowded inside, fear buzzing like flies. Voices rose, arguing, panicking. Jonah stood, and the noise died. "You all know what waits if we do not act," he said, voice low but firm. "They'll sweep north, and this town will burn like the rest. We can wait and pray, or we can meet them on the trail." The sheriff nodded, old eyes weary but resolute. "I stand with Hayes." So it was settled. A posse rode at dawn, Jonah at the front, Dusty carrying him steady, despite the limp that never quite left. Behind them, men of Timber Mesa carried rifles with grim determination. They tracked the rustlers 3 days into the Badlands. Heat shimmered off the stone, rattlesnakes slid across their path, and water ran low. Dusty pressed on without falter, as if knowing the weight of what they carried. On the 4th day they found them, camped in a canyon, the stolen herd corralled, sentries careless in the noonday heat. Jonah studied the ground, then turned to the men. "We hit fast, we hit hard, no time for fear. For every family waiting back in town, we make our stand here." They nodded, jaws set. At Jonah's signal they charged. Dusty thundered down the slope, Jonah's rifle cracking, rustlers scrambled, curses echoing off stone. Guns roared, dust rose, cattle bawled. Jonah rode straight through, Dusty's hooves scattering men like quail. A bullet grazed Jonah's shoulder, another sang past his ear, but he fired back, each shot true. The blacksmith's rifle boomed from the ridge, dropping 2. The sheriff's shotgun barked, scattering 3 more. In minutes it was done. Rustlers lay dead or bound, the herd lowing uneasy but safe. Jonah sat astride Dusty in the silence after, chest heaving, eyes scanning the canyon. Slowly he raised his hand, signaling the fight was over. Cheers rose, echoing against the stone. Men clasped hands, relief flooding their faces. Back in Timber Mesa, the town hailed them saviors. A feast was laid, tables groaning with food. Jonah sat quiet at the edge, Dusty tethered nearby, eating his own fill of oats. The children crowned Dusty with wildflowers, their laughter ringing. For the first time in years, Jonah felt the ache in his chest ease. He belonged. He had a place, a people, and a purpose. The legend of Jonah Hayes and Dusty spread far across the territory. Travelers carried it down the trails, adding their own flourishes. Some said Dusty had outrun 100 bullets. Others swore Jonah faced down 20 men alone. The truth mattered less than the spirit. A drifter and a broken horse had stood when others would not. But for Jonah, legend meant little. What mattered was the feel of Dusty's steady breath at his shoulder each dawn, the warmth of the sun over the mesa, the sound of hammers building homes stronger than before. One autumn evening, Jonah led Dusty up the ridge above town. They stood together as the sun set, painting the land in fire. Jonah laid a hand on the horse's neck, voice low. "You were left to die, boy, and I was too, in my own way. But we didn't. We stood. Long as I breathe, you'll never be alone again." Dusty nickered, pressing his muzzle into Jonah's chest. The cowboy closed his eyes, breathing deep, and for the first time in a long, long while, he felt whole. Winter rolled over Timber Mesa once more, this time with deeper snows than any living could remember. The drifts reached the windowsills, the cattle bawled hungry against the fences, and the wood piles sank low before January was half done. Folks spoke of the winter of '82 like it was a living enemy, and in truth it felt that way. Cold had teeth, wind had claws, and every step outdoors was a fight. Jonah and Dusty bore it together. The livery roof leaked, so Jonah spent nights patching with tar and boards until his fingers bled from the cold. Dusty's breath steamed into the frosty air, mane thick with ice, but his eyes remained bright. Jonah rationed oats, gave Dusty the larger share, and lived on thin stew stretched with beans. He'd smile through cracked lips and say, "We'll see the spring, boy, you and me. Ain't nothing out here tough enough to break us now." Yet even as the blizzards raged, danger crept. Word came of escape. Clyde Barrow had slipped his irons. No one knew how. Bribery, trickery, or sheer devil's luck. But the news reached Timber Mesa like a snake's hiss. The sheriff gathered men in the saloon, voice grim. "If Clyde breathes free, he'll come here. His hate burns hotter than any stove. Hayes, he'll be gunning for you." Jonah just nodded slow. "Then let him come. I ain't hidin'." For weeks nothing stirred, but Jonah felt it, the sense of eyes in the dark, the way Dusty stamped restless at night. And then, one brittle dawn, riders appeared on the ridge. 5 men, Clyde at their head, his shoulders stiff, but his grin wide. The town braced. Women hurried children into cellars, men cocked rifles, the sheriff barked orders. But Clyde didn't charge. He sat his horse bold, calling across the frost, "Hayes, I come for you in that nag. Step out or I burn this town down." Jonah swung into Dusty's saddle, rifle across his lap. He rode forward until only a stretch of frozen creek separated them. "You had your chance, Clyde," Jonah called. "Walk away." Clyde laughed, bitter as rust. "You shamed me, Hayes. Took my place, took my name. You think these folks respect you? They'll bury you instead." He raised his pistol. The world froze. Jonah whispered into Dusty's ear, "One more stand, boy. Just you and me." Gunfire cracked like splitting ice. Jonah spurred Dusty, weaving, firing steady. The outlaw's shots rang wide as Dusty cut swift through snow. Jonah's bullets found their mark. One man toppled, another screamed and fell. Clyde cursed, spurring forward, his gelding foaming at the bit. He and Jonah closed in a swirl of powder and smoke, pistols blazing. A shot rang. Dusty screamed, stumbled. Jonah's heart split, but Dusty gathered himself, surged on. Jonah's pistol barked once more, and Clyde pitched backward from his saddle, eyes wide in shock, body thudding into the snow. The remaining outlaws fled, fear breaking them faster than bullets. Silence fell heavy. Jonah leapt down, dropping to Dusty's side. Blood welled from the horse's shoulder, steaming in the cold. "No, boy, no," Jonah gasped, pressing his hands hard to the wound. "Stay with me." Dusty trembled, eyes rolling. Jonah whispered over and over, his voice breaking. "Dusty, Dusty, stay. You're stronger in this. We beat worse. Don't you leave me now." Townsfolk rushed from cover, hands reaching, voices anxious. The blacksmith knelt, tore his coat into bandages. Widow Carter pressed cloth to the wound. Jonah never left Dusty's side, never stopped whispering his name. Hours stretched. The bleeding slowed. Dusty's breath steadied, shallow but sure. By nightfall he stood weak but upright, Jonah's arm wrapped tight around his neck. The town cheered, not just for survival, not just for Clyde's end, but for Dusty, who refused to die. Weeks passed. Dusty healed, though the scar remained deep. Jonah healed too, though his own scars, inside and out, ran deeper still. And slowly, life steadied. Fields thawed, cattle calved, laughter returned. One evening the sheriff came to Jonah with a folded paper. "Territorial Council voted," he said. "Land grant's yours if you want it. Folks say it's time you had a place of your own." Jonah unfolded the deed with shaking hands. His name inked across it bold. A cabin by the creek, pasture enough for stock. He looked at Dusty grazing near, and felt his throat tighten. He built that cabin with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. The town came to help, each man and woman offering what they could. Children painted crude flowers on the fence, women stitched curtains, men split logs, and when it was done, Jonah led Dusty through the gate, whispering, "We got a home now, boy. You saved me. You saved us all." Years rolled on, timber mesa grew, fences stretching wider, roofs rising taller. Jonah aged, hair silvering, back stiffening. But Dusty remained, scarred yet proud, the legend of the horse left to die, and the cowboy who refused to give up. On quiet evenings, Jonah would sit on the porch, Dusty grazing within sight. Children would gather at his knee, wide-eyed, asking for the story. Jonah would smile, voice soft. "They left him for the buzzards, but I gave him a name. That's all it took. A name and the promise I wouldn't quit. He gave me back my life. Never forget, young'uns. Sometimes the broken things are the strongest." The sun would sink behind the mesa, painting the world in gold, and Jonah would lean against Dusty's shoulder, both of them scarred, both of them survivors. And in the hush of twilight, the town would hear Jonah's whisper, steady as ever, "Dusty." The horse would nicker soft, and the legend would live on. The seasons turned again, each one leaving its mark on the valley, each one deepening the bond between Jonah and Dusty. Spring brought floods that swallowed the low fields, and Jonah rode the swollen banks, rope in hand, pulling children and calves from waters that would have swept them away. Summer came with drought, and Jonah and Dusty hauled barrels of water from the deep creek to families whose wells had run dry. Autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, and Jonah helped drive fattened herds to market, Dusty steady beneath him, his limp almost forgotten now except in the coldest mornings. Winter, always the harshest teacher, came with a storm so fierce it buried half the town under drifts higher than a man's shoulders. The wind howled for 3 nights straight, shutters tore from windows, roofs groaned, and cattle froze where they stood. Jonah and Dusty broke trail through the white hell, hauling firewood, leading wagons, pulling downed beams off crushed barns. Men swore the town would not have survived without them. Jonah never spoke of it. He only whispered Dusty's name in the whistling dark, and the horse pressed on. By then, Jonah's cabin by the creek had grown into a proper home. Neighbors came often, some for advice, some for help, some just to sit near the fire and hear Jonah tell his stories. Children came daily, feeding Dusty apples, braiding flowers into his mane. Folks started calling Jonah the Man of the Mesa, a name he never asked for but could not shake. It was a warm evening when the preacher stopped by, hat in hand. He was a good man, old and kind, his hair white as snow. He sat on Jonah's porch, eyes on Dusty grazing in the field, and said, "Mr. Hayes, I believe the Lord sent that horse to you. He carried not only himself out of death's shadow, but you too. Men in this town have more faith because of you two than they do from any sermon." Jonah smiled faint, staring at the horizon. "Reckon the Lord works in strange ways. But I ain't no saint, preacher. I just couldn't walk away from him." The preacher nodded. "Sometimes that's all the Lord asks, that we don't walk away." Word of Jonah and Dusty's deeds had long spread beyond Timber Mesa. Riders came from distant towns to see them, to ask for help, to hear the tale with their own ears. A newspaper man from Denver arrived one autumn, notebook in hand, scribbling down every word Jonah offered. When the story printed, it called them the unbreakable pair, the cowboy and the horse who refused to die. Jonah laughed when he heard it read aloud in the saloon. Unbreakable. We've been broken near every way a man and horse can be. But his eyes shone proud as Dusty lifted his head at the sound of his name. Years wore on. Jonah grew slower, hair silvering, his once straight back bending with time. But Dusty stayed beside him, every step steady, every breath a reminder that miracles walk in plain hides. The two grew old together, scars deep but hearts stronger. Then came the spring of the great fire. Lightning struck the dry hills after weeks without rain. Flames raced faster than a galloping horse, devouring brush, barns, even the edge of town. Panic spread, families fleeing with whatever they could carry. Jonah, old as he was, swung into Dusty's saddle once more. They rode into the smoke, voices calling for children lost in the chaos. Jonah and Dusty pulled them from burning sheds, led wagons through choking blackness, even dragged water barrels against the fire lines. Ash blackened Jonah's beard, flames singed Dusty's mane, but they did not falter. At last, when the flames were beaten back and the town stood singed but standing, Jonah slid from the saddle, coughing, his chest heavy with smoke. Dusty lowered his head, sides heaving, eyes tired but unbowed. Jonah laid a trembling hand on his neck and whispered, "Still standing, boy. Always." It was the last great trial they faced. After that, Timber Mesa entered years of peace. The raiders never returned. The herds grew fat, the barns full. Children grew to adults telling their children the story of Jonah and Dusty by firelight. One crisp autumn morning, Jonah sat on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise golden over the mesa. Dusty grazed near, slower now, his muzzle gray, but still steady, still proud. Jonah's breath rattled, his body frail, but his eyes were calm. He whispered, voice soft as wind, "We done it, boy. We proved 'em wrong. They left you for dead, and they left me too. But we didn't die. We lived, and we gave this town a reason to believe." Dusty lifted his head, ears pricking at the sound of his name. He walked slow to Jonah's side, lowered his great head into the cowboy's lap. Jonah stroked him, tears shining, and smiled one last time. When neighbors came later, they found Jonah sitting peaceful, Dusty standing close, guarding him. The old cowboy had gone quiet into the long night, but Dusty's eyes were steady, as if he'd known the moment before it came. The town buried Jonah on the ridge above the creek, where he had first whispered Dusty's name. They carved no fancy stone, only a marker of wood, etched simple. Jonah Hayes, he stood. Dusty lived on a few more years, grazing the pastures Jonah had built, always wandering back to that ridge at a sunset, standing by the grave until the stars wheeled overhead. When at last he too lay down and did not rise, the town buried him beside Jonah, two survivors side by side, unbroken even in death. And the story of them lingered. Parents told it to their children. travelers carried it across the frontier. They spoke of the horse left to die, of the drifter with nothing, of how a name whispered in the dust gave both a second life. They spoke of courage, of mercy, of standing when the world demanded you fall. And long after Timber Mesa grew into a bustling town with rail lines and telegraph wires, long after the names of cattle barons and outlaws were forgotten, folks still spoke with reverence of Jonah and Dusty, not as legend only, but as truth, proof that in the Wild West sometimes the weakest became the strongest, and the forgotten became the heart of a town. The years after Jonah Hayes and Dusty were laid to rest rolled forward like the slow, steady current of the creek below their ridge. Timber Mesa did not forget them. The town grew, buildings rising taller, streets filling with wagons, and in time the first shriek of a locomotive echoed across the valley. Steel rails cut through the land where once only hoofbeats had ruled. Telegraph wires strung taut hummed in the wind like fiddle strings. The world changed, but the memory of Jonah and Dusty clung to Timber Mesa like sage to the hills. At first it was spoken of in quiet voices by those who had lived it, by the blacksmith with soot still in his beard, by the widow Carter rocking her grandchild, by Sheriff Mallory when he was old and stiff and sitting by the stove in the saloon. "I was there," they would say. "I saw the man and the horse that no bullet, no storm, no enemy could break." The young would listen wide-eyed, their imaginations painting the pictures of smoke and fire and the brave horse that never quit. In time those children grew, and they told the tale to their own. The story walked further than Jonah himself had ever traveled. Cowboys on the cattle trails carried it down to Texas. Miners told it in saloons in Colorado camps. Merchants repeated it in Denver, Santa Fe, even as far as San Francisco. The names Jonah Hayes and Dusty carried a weight, not of riches or conquest, but of endurance, of standing when all the world thought you'd fall. Timber Mesa, once a dot on the map, became known as the town that stood. Travelers would stop at the ridge before riding in, tip their hats to the two simple graves, and whisper their own prayers or thanks. Some left tokens, a sprig of sage, a coil of rope, a child's ribbon. The wind carried those offerings across the grass, and the townsfolk believed that so long as those graves were honored, the town would endure. Years after the railroad came, a great drought struck. The land cracked, the creek ran thin, and the cattle bawled for water. Many spoke of leaving, of packing wagons, and heading east. But an old rancher, gray and bent, stood in the square and pointed to the ridge. Did Jonah leave when he was beaten? Did Dusty lie down when he was broke? No, they stood, and so shall we. The town stayed, dug deeper wells, drove their herds farther, and when the rains came again, Timber Mesa had survived. A generation later, when outlaws swept down from the north, the men of Timber Mesa met them on the open range. Outnumbered, outgunned, they remembered the tales of Jonah and Dusty. They fought with a fury that turned the raiders aside. The spirit of the horse was with us, they told their children. The graves weathered in sun and storm, the wooden markers fading, but the memory remained bright. Finally, the townsfolk built a stone monument on that ridge. Carved into it was a rider and his horse, standing together, eyes fixed on the horizon. Beneath, simple words. They stood when others fell, and the legend lived. Boys growing into men whispered Jonah's name as they saddled their first colts. Girls plaiting ribbons spoke Dusty's name when they tied them into manes. Drifters stopping for whiskey found themselves sitting straighter when they heard the story, some even choosing to stay, saying, "If a man and a horse like that walked here, maybe I can belong too." One harsh winter, nearly 50 years after Jonah's death, an old man arrived by train. His hair was silver, his coat fine, but his eyes carried dust and sorrow. He stood long at the monument, hat in hand. Folks asked later who he was, but none could say. Some swore he was a ranch hand who had once ridden against Jonah and never forgot. Others whispered he was a boy Dusty had saved in the smoke of that long-ago fire. The man left no name, only tears on the stone and a coin pressed into the earth. As decades turned, Timber Mesa shifted from frontier town to thriving settlement, but still, the story was told. When schoolhouses were built, Jonah and Dusty's tale was read aloud to the children. When churches rang their bells, prayers of thanks included their names. Even when the old sheriff's badge was hung on the wall of the courthouse, beside it rested Jonah's weathered hat, brim curled, found years before at the cabin by the creek. People began to say that Jonah and Dusty had never truly left. Travelers claimed that on still nights, with moonlight silvering the ridge, a man might hear hoofbeats where no horse ran, and a voice low and steady whispering a name, Dusty. And if a horse panicked, tangled in wire, or a rider lay hurt on the trail, some swore a bay horse with a scar on his flank would appear just long enough to lead them to safety, vanishing when help arrived. Believers smiled and said that was Dusty still standing guard. Generations came and went, and still the legend lived. The railroad whistled, automobiles chugged, telephones rang. But on that ridge above the creek, the graves watched unchanged. And every child of Timber Mesa grew up knowing that once there was a broken horse and a broken man, each left for dead, who found strength in each other and in standing, saved a town, and carved their names into forever. And so it was that Jonah Hayes and Dusty did not die in truth. They lived in every act of courage, every kindness to the weak, every moment a man or woman chose to stand when it was easier to walk away. For in the end, that was their gift, the reminder that broken things endure and forgotten souls can become the heart of a people.